I would like to talk about a couple of concepts that I find extremely useful. They're very old. They were used and conceived of by Michelangelo, so they've got a history. I think it's important to understand that our notion that there's a single light source is an idea. It's hard to pull that idea off when, say, you're in a room and lighting something, and there's all kinds of light in the room, and you're trying to create a special condition where there's a single light source on your subject. When you do that, you're actually working conceptually with an idea. It's not what actually happens in a room when you have bounced light that's coming from everywhere. I think this single light source idea was established a long time ago. I mean, after all, a lot of the Italian Renaissance painters and artists, they were working with light sources that weren't so as electric as the ones we're working with. They were relying a lot on the available light and manipulating that available light as well as they could. Well, they must have run into the same conditions and problems that we all do, is that light has its own way of either revealing form or destroying form. They've done a lot of analysis and a lot of thinking about these things and established certain clear ideas so that the story they wanted to tell visually was equally as clear. So the clear idea about light is that we could say, like the sun, there's a single light source. And on occasion, we get bounced light. Bounced light creates an interesting effect. It's also referred to as reflective light. So when you have, for instance, a single light source, and let's just say it's hitting a sphere, okay, let's just say it's hitting a sphere. And let's say it's hitting up in this area someplace, maybe like that. So it's hitting up in this area. As it goes around this sphere, we're getting more and more tone as it turns away from the light source. More and more tone as it goes away from the light source. If it's a really dark space, that could get very dark. That could also create a cast shadow. Let's just talk about that for a moment. So it might create a cast shadow. So this might represent that. And because it's hitting here, there might be a slight bit of tone around this side. Might be. But essentially, it's kind of like that. So, and as a result, we do experience the volume. We don't experience this as a disk. We experience it as a volume. We're treating this form as if it's a sphere, not a disk, by the way we're lighting it. And on the other hand, let's say we have the same condition, but the light is bounced. So we've got this happening, but there's a phenomenon which happened, which is called core shadow. Core shadow is the shadow between the lightest light and the dark side when you have light that bounces back. So when you have light that bounces back, you get a certain degree of light in the tone side. Right? It still casts its shadow. All right. If this bounced light is really bright, then the cast shadow will be darker. If we look, say, at let's do this. If we look at, say, a Caravaggio, the dark in here is going to be very dark. And he gives us a movement across all his form through the light. We're jumping. The eye jumps from one light source to another and bounces around the frame. Cast shadow and so on. So that's an extreme where you have, even though there is some reflected light, it's very dark in there. We go all the way over to here, And this is more the way, for instance, Tiepolo uses light, which is a little time later in the scheme of things. And essentially, he has his figures up in the clouds, so he wants them to be as light-filled as possible. But the interesting thing is that he's still using this concept of single light source. But if you're up in the middle of the air, light is coming from every direction. It's bouncing off of clouds. And essentially, you get something which could completely destroy the volume, and we might just simply see the shapes if we're lucky. So what he's done is he's created a Renaissance approach to lighting the figure, which allows him to creatively go into it and make these ribbons of core shadow that have a life of their own with little accents here and there, and it's really quite beautiful. But once you look at it that way, you'll begin to realize that it's highly unlikely that somebody up in the clouds would be lit like that. Okay, so what are the elements here? The elements are, we have with a direct light source, and since we're working on white paper, we'll take the highlight, which would have been here. This would have been local color. So you could say the highlight, the local tone, core shadow, reflected light, cast shadow. Right. And if this gradates at all into this, we also get halftone. So what are we talking about? We're talking about highlight, local tone, 3 halftone, 4 core shadow, 5 reflected light, 6 cast shadow. They each have their own properties. In this particular case, when we're talking about cast shadow, it's darkest closest to the object that's casting the shadow, and then it might even be sharpest. But as it pulls away, as that shadow spreads out away from the object that's casting it, it has a tendency to become more light-filled, and the edges much fuzzier. Okay, so that's one of the characteristics of that. Now, this is one form of light which I think is really going to be important when we start talking about breaking form down into volumes described by light and tone. This is one of the important forms. And the other one I think that's important, and by the way, this is all under formulation. These are 2 different ideas about light. The other one is when there is no light source, but you want to make a description of the form in some way, you create a light source. So in this particular case, I just like to use this phrase because I think it states it as clearly as possible. Center of the form gets the light. What that means is that the center of form that's facing you, the observer, gets the light, as if you had a third eye that you switched on at a certain wattage, maybe 30 watts. Maybe this is 70 watts, but this might be 30 watts. I'm just going to do this. Okay, so center of the form gets the light. That means as we travel out towards the edges, you see, it becomes more and more in tone until it actually hits that edge. Now that could be darker or lighter. Doesn't really matter. But what this does do is it gives a description of form, which is an independent idea from there being a direct light source. Once this is understood, it's possible to change the light source from directly from the center between one's 2 eyes, the observer's 2 eyes, to a new location, a location that might better benefit what it is that we're trying to say about form. For instance, this tells us one thing, and it's very strong. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't tell us anything about this quadrant in here. So oftentimes, when a light source hits an object, it blasts it out. So we get lots of form around where the shadow meets the light, and maybe in some other places, but oftentimes washes the tone out along the edges. So it could be, for instance, that we could take that secondary light as a kind of helping light. Photographers would call it fill light. They're using it to help create the visual story that they want to tell, however they use it. It's to enhance their vision, enhance the shot. So in this case, let's say we've got some tone here, and it breaks into coarse shadow because this in fact is going to be it's going to have reflected light, and this goes flat. But we could take this idea here and apply it to this section. We can say, well, this is kind of flat, and what I'd like to see is a sense that this goes around. And you'll see, that's why I'm saying that this is at a small percentage compared to 70% on this side. This could be 30%. All it needs is just a touch to help us find our way around the form. Okay, so this idea is being applied here. This idea is being applied here. All right. Now, we can take that whole notion of this into more organic forms. Do understand, though, that if the light is hitting the center of the form, it depends on what that form is as to where that light will be. It will not always be a spot. It might be something like this, where the closest to the light source is in the center of this tube, for instance. So it's going to be more of a line than it is a spot. So you have to keep in mind that you cannot light something unless you know what its volume is. If you do, for instance, a shape that's like this, without knowing what its volume is, we can't really say much about it. But once you understand its volume, then we can light it. Supposing, for instance, that this is again, something like this. And a little curve to that. We start to feel that it has three-dimensional properties. All right, and that goes for anything, even this. We can't really light that until we've decided that it's a sphere. It could be a cone. It could be an impression. It could be any number of things. So if you're actually drawing your figure, without understanding what these forms are really doing, volumetrically, you cannot light it. But the moment you decide, for instance, that you have a light source coming from here and you have a top surface, then you can kind of come along and say, well, all of this is going to be in tone, right? and maybe here, and maybe here, because you've decided, for instance, that this is turning away from the light source. Maybe this pinches it over here like that. Maybe this pinches. See a little bit here. Maybe this drops down and in, right? So the whole head drops back. If you follow me on this, then I think it might be possible to talk in more specific terms about how we would work with this, you see, so we can start to give a sense of space with our figure by understanding its volumes and using light and tone to describe the form. We'll go into that in a little more detail in just a bit.